Okay, Chair, you are live.
I would like to call the Committee of the Whole meeting of October 6, 2021 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul McPherson, Counselor and Chair of the General Business and Finance Committee. We are meeting electronically through Zoom during this declared emergency period. Members of the public may observe the proceedings by accessing the live webcast on our YouTube channel. I will ask our Deputy Clerk to complete a roll call of council so that we can confirm quorum. Van, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Easton.
Yes.
Thank you, Councilor Rajima.
Here.
Deputy Mayor Russell.
Here.
Councilor Bernay. Councilor Bernay, I see you.
Yes, present.
Councilor Pachariva.
Present.
Councilor McPherson.
Here.
Councilor Micklick.
Here.
Councilor Reimer.
Here.
And Councilor Timmers.
Here.
Thank you. We have quorum, Chair.
Thank you. In addition, I want to take a moment to welcome the staff we have joining us today electronically. Chief Administrative Officer Mike Rokopoulos, Director of Legislative Services, Town Clerk Julie Kirkolos, Director of Special Projects Kathleen Dale, Director of Planning and Development Matt Bruder, Director of Economic Development and Communications Paul Deaney, Director of Finance Administration and Innovation Lawrence Wagner, Director of Community Services Shannon McKay, Director of Public Works David Graham, and moderating and clerking the meeting today, we have our Deputy Clerk, Devan Kripp. IT staff are also in attendance. As this is a virtual meeting, I will ask that we follow some procedures during this electronic meeting. Should there be a connection or service disruption for the chair, or if quorum is lost, the chair and or Deputy Clerk will call a 10-minute recess to reconnect and to regain quorum. If quorum is lost, the meeting will be adjourned. If connection is lost from the chair, the Deputy Clerk will ask those in attendance to wait up to 10 minutes to provide the chair time to reconnect and resume the meeting. Otherwise, after that time frame, the Vice Chair will resume the meeting until the chair has reconnected and resumes their role. Each member of council who wishes to speak, press the raised hand feature on your video call, and the Deputy Clerk will track our speakers list tonight and then invite you to speak when I open it for comments or questions. Also, when I finish reading a motion announcing the mover, the Deputy Clerk will then call out the vote by reading each member of council's name out loud. Please remember to take yourselves off mute during this portion of the meeting so that you can confirm if you support or oppose. Also, when not speaking, please remember to put yourselves on mute. Declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing none. Statutory public meetings. We have no statutory public meetings this evening. Delegations. There are no registered delegations this evening for the General Business and Finance Committee agenda. Consent agenda. There are no consent agenda items this evening. Reports. We will now consider item 5.3.1 report AD-21-21 Community Improvement Plan Activity and Monitoring. Prior to the presentation, I will ask that council proceed with a majority vote to extend the speaking time for the delegation. I have a motion moved by Councilor Reimer that councilor extends the speaking time until the Community Improvement Plan Activity and Monitoring presentation is complete. I will now ask our Deputy Clerk to call out the vote. Devan, please go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. Councilor Bernay.
Yes.
Councilor McPherson.
Yes.
Councilor Micklick.
Yes.
Councilor Pachariva.
Yes.
Councilor Reimer.
Yes.
Councilor Rajima.
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Russell.
Yes.
Councilor Timmers.
Yes.
And Mayor Easton.
Support.
Thank you. That carries.
Thank you. I will ask that members of council save their questions for the end of the presentation. The Chief Administrative Officer would like to say a few words before staff begin the presentation. Mike, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'm going to ask Devan to pull up the presentation. I'm actually going to take you through a few of the first slides, really talking about the purpose of today's meeting. And then I will turn it over to Directors Dale, Deaney, and Wagner to take you through the various elements. And then I will have some closing comments at the end. Devan, if you could pull up the presentation, maybe as I'm So next slide. So a little bit about the purpose of today's meeting. Council directed us to review our CIP program a few months back. We have begun that work, and the work that we're starting right now will take us into likely the second quarter of 2022 by the time we're done. As we get further into the presentation, I think Council will see the various elements, the various points in this conversation. And so we will give you a little bit of an overview of where we're at. I like to characterize what we're going to do today as really that data gathering, data presenting stage for Council. There is no decision point, and I do highlight that because yesterday I did, and over the last number of days, I have been engaging with residents, members of Council, having great conversations. There will be a engagement element that Paul will speak to later in the presentation. And I think we always want that level of engagement, especially on a topic as important as this. So first and foremost, no decisions today. Today is really to share that information with member of Council. So again, we are in front of you to give you a little bit of background, talk a little bit about the CIPs we have in place, what's been the success of those CIPs, and really what is the next step. I will say, without presupposing where we're going and what the final result is, staff wholeheartedly agree, and I think members of Council wholeheartedly agree. We need to look at our CIPs and they need to change and evolve. If you look at the 5 that are currently in place, really the ones that deal with some of the residential development that we're talking about, that is often the subject of conversation or debate. And that first one, that large one, really dates back to 2011 when you look at the Beamsville commercial core area. We've also got a mixed use one dating back to 2016. I recall when I joined the organization about 5.5 years ago, Niagara region and every municipality in Niagara was looking at CIPs and had a very similar program. We were at a very different time in our, I think, evolution as a region. Niagara as a region probably wasn't as desirable as it is today, and not a destination choice for people. And I think there was a lot of competition with the GTHA. Where we are now, again, fast forwarding a decade to a half a decade, I think things are very different. And so staff, again, I'll emphasize, agree we need to evolve and look at our CIP programs. Next slide. So tonight's agenda really, again, is going to focus a little bit on our policies, plans, and strategies that Council's put in place, how what we've got ties into that, a little bit about the goals of community improvement plans and why we have them, some KPIs that we've been looking at, a little bit of the activity around community improvement plans. Often we get asked, what is the economic value or economic input or output potentially that comes as a result of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about housing units by type. We're going to talk about things that I think, we're talking about around our affordable housing table, things around attainable housing, rental housing, what are the voids that we have here in Lincoln, and what do we hope to achieve. A little bit around assessment and taxes generated, and Lawrence can speak to that. A little bit around review and updates and questions. Now, one of the things that we're also going to touch on, and you'll see it on the following slides, is really around the environmental elements that go along with community improvement plans. Last night when I was engaging with a resident, she actually shared with me a project in Milton and caveated that Milton isn't where we necessarily look to for good planning advice often, but there was a great development incentivized through community improvement plans using geothermal, using other sorts of green technology. And she really shared it with myself and her ward counselors as a model to what we should be looking at. So again, some of the things we're going to talk about as we go through the presentation. Next slide. I will now turn the next slide over to Director Deanne.
Thank you, Mike, and good evening, Mary Easton and members of Council. As Mike indicated, the next few slides will be speaking to several strategies, policies, and plans that will help guide the day-to-day work that staff accomplish on behalf of our residents. These strategies, policies, and plans also act for the basis and foundational element for our community improvement plans whether it be our economic development strategy or, as Mike mentioned, our climate adaptation plan. These documents and the associated CIPs help council and staff shape the community for the better. While each of these strategies have many associated action items, we'll be just touching on a few salient points that are supported directly by our CIPs. Madam Deputy Clerk, next slide, please.
Thank you. I'm actually just going to pause you for a second because it's come to my attention that it's not displaying full screen. So I'm just going to fix that for everyone.
Okay, perfect. Next slide, please.
Hi, thank you for your patience. We will move forward.
Perfect. Thanks, Joanne. If we can go to the next slide, yeah, right there. So first and foremost is our council priorities guiding document, which lays out several key elements and associated items as we strive to make Lincoln a welcoming, connected, vibrant, and resilient community. And I know Kathleen will be touching on the climate adaptation in a subsequent slide, but if we can focus on one item under our resilient community, that is promoting a green and low environmental impact development, which is something our community improvement plans are tailored towards accomplishing. Also, affordable and accessible housing is another key element that will help attract and keep families in Lincoln, which will support our local economy and labor pool. Overarching, each of these items on this page are supported by our community improvement plans. Next slide. Our economic development strategy called for the creation of a CIP program that supports private sector investment. And although new, the adoption of our rural areas and industrial land CIP has already proven to be useful in creating economic activity in Lincoln, both in our rural areas supporting our craft beverage and tourism industry, as well as in our industrial areas, encouraging more investment. And I'd like to turn it over to Director Dale, if I may. Thank you, Madam Clerk.
Okay, thanks, Paul. If you could go to the next slide, please, today, slide 7. Okay. So yeah, in regards to our climate change plan, Paul touched on it a bit. Really what it's doing is it's promoting green infrastructure and low impact development standards on public and private property. When we look at things like, building code and typical development standards, those are minimum standards that don't necessarily address climate change. So developers only have to build to minimum standards. By providing some incentives, it can help encourage, green infrastructure of various items. Can you go to next slide, please, Devan? So we also have an official plan in place. And so what the official plan does is municipalities are, if you want to use community improvement plans, you're required to have policies in your official plan that talk about, what are some of your goals and objectives in those community improvement plans. So although there's a number of them listed on slides 8 and 9, I think probably some of the key objectives in our official plan as it relates to community improvement is improving the supply of affordable housing and providing a range of housing choices. We all know that housing prices have gone up an awful lot over the last few years, and low and medium density is starting to be out of reach for a lot of homeowners. It also promotes revitalization of our downtowns and improving the viability of our downtowns, this could be through improvements to buildings and also the creation of new businesses within new developments. It also encourages the redevelopment of vacant lands, which helps improve our assessment and tax base. Supporting economic development and tourism, for example, creates jobs, and it also encourages more accommodation to be constructed. It supports improved streetscapes and active transportation through improved facilities for cycling and pedestrians, such as bike racks, benches, new and or widened sidewalks, and street trees for shade. And these are things that with a CIP, you can impose higher standards on development. Next slide, please. So we also have can you go to slide 11, please? Actually, I think it's the previous slide, sorry. The one, there we go. Thank you, sorry about that. So we also have a Parks, Recreation, Culture Master Plan, and this is also a fairly recent document that was approved by Council. So one of the things that's come out of that study is we do have the public really is expecting a wider range of uses and facilities. And we're seeing that in our new Rotary Park, which is under construction. As well, this plan also supports, beautification of our public spaces. And those aren't just parks, but all public spaces which support private sector investments. If you look at it from whether you're a resident or a visitor, people like to visit areas that look nice, don't have rundown buildings, and are well maintained. And our CIPs do help with some of the grants, for people to improve their buildings and structures. Next slide, please. We also have a transportation master plan. And one of the goals in our transportation master plan is to promote transit. And this includes enhanced GO transit to reduce dependency on cars. What you need in order to get your GO transit is you need a critical mass of development to support GO. And this is what has been contemplated through the recent approved GO secondary plan. As well, the redevelopment of lands in our central business districts or along intensification areas also provide opportunities, as I mentioned before, to acquire lands for widenings, so that you can improve your streetscapes. You do widen sidewalks, street trees, benches, bike parking, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to turn it back over to Paul.
Thank you, Kathleen. So, members of council, our CIPs were created with goals to help create a community that is attractive for both private sector investment, but also families looking to create a home and life for themselves and their families. These goals, which are diverse depending on the CIP you are looking at, are attainable through council's commitment to shaping the community we want. So whether it's enhancing facades in downtown Beamsville to help attract private sector investment into our rural areas, CIPs in general need to be measurable and purposeful, and these goals are basically measured against the success of the CIPs themselves. So in regards to slide 13, you'll see a number of these sort of goals and achievable attainments on these slides here. And for slide 14, in addition, you'll see some of the other goals, which are designed to achieve and create jobs, develop underutilized lands, and grow our economy. Overarching, as Director Dale had mentioned, whether it's in the rural areas or the downtown areas or industrial lands, CIPs in general need to have those goals, which are measurable and have attainable focuses for our community and our improvement plans. Thank you, Director Dale. Back over to you.
Okay, so could we go to slide 15, please? Slide 16, please. So it's really important, and I know our CIO has mentioned this at the very beginning, is that when you have CIPs, you should do some monitoring and you look at your key performance indicators. So the reason why we do that is we need to look and see, where do we need it to make adjustments to our programs? We need to review the economic impact of our projects, because CIPs are really a proactive plan to support economic development and community renewal. And we also recognize too that over time, the priorities of municipalities change. So you need to be able to update your CIPs to reflect the changing priorities. Next slide, please. So in regards to the community improvement plans, when those plans were first established, there were a number of KPIs established by those CIPs. And these are the types of items that need to be reviewed to determine whether your CIPs are effective or whether you should be making changes to those. So, I mean, they're listed on the screen. It's things like, the types of applications, whether you're having, is there an increase in taxes? Is your assessment going up? Are we creating, jobs, affordable housing units, new businesses, et cetera? Next slide, please. So the next two slides, slides 19 and 20, what we've done here for council is, this is a visual of where the CIP applications have been. So it provides sort of a general location of where the applications have been. You'll probably notice that there's an awful lot of blue stars in the Beamsville area. And this is because the Beamsville CIP is the one that's been around the longest. So there's been more uptake in that application. And as Mr. Deanne mentioned, we do have a industrial and rural area CIP. And what we're finding is we're starting to get a bit more uptake in that particular CIP for things like value added and agritourism uses, and also some industrial uses. Next slide, please. Actually, skip to slide 21. So to date, actually I should say not to date, but as of the end of December of last year, there's been 42 applications that have been approved, and to date, we've got 29 projects completed. Okay, so I'm now going to turn it over to Lawrence, starting for slide 22.
Thanks, Kathleen. Just going through this slide and looking at the slide. So as mentioned in the previous slide, a total of 29 projects were completed from the time period 2012 to 2020. On average, that's about 3 to 4 construction projects yearly that the town supported. As you can see, the total construction value for all the projects, or the 29 projects, both with the town and region contributions, total investment was $9 million. This includes the town and region contributions of about $2 million. So for every dollar the town invested, the original $1 million, it leveraged about $8 million investment, both region and private sector investment. Now I'll turn it over to Paul to take you through the next few slides.
Thank you, Lawrence. So to help measure the success of our CIPs and how it relates to attracting business and creating jobs, we did survey several of our developments, asking them for the numbers of employees they employ. That way we can trace back our investment to actual accomplishments. Next slide. So to date, we have created 17 new commercial units in our community, which has resulted in over 155 new jobs. We anticipate these numbers to jump significantly as we have several applications in the work for new businesses through our rural areas and industrial land CIP. While we recognize that not every employee is a resident of Lincoln, there are still multiplier effects for dollars earned and the associated spend in the community. At the end of the day, the more jobs and people we bring to Lincoln, the more we can grow and support our local economy by way of spending and entrepreneurship. Thank you. Back over to you, Kathleen.
So if we could go to slide 26, please. So if we look at our CIP programs, they have encouraged the construction of multiple and apartment units within some new mixed-use developments. So what also comes along with that residential is a commercial aspect to it. Prior to the approval of the mixed-use CIP in late 2016, very few apartment units were constructed and no new apartments or smaller multiple units were constructed within the downtown area. Mixed-use projects, they support livable communities. And really what that means is that this, by providing, a bit more of a choice for housing, it allows people to remain in their homes and their communities as they age. It gives them an option, if they want to downsize and move to a smaller unit. It also provides, in some cases, housing for first-time home buyers. Next slide, please. So I think if we look at the next slide, 6, no, can you go back to slide 26, please? Sorry, skipped ahead. So in regards to our CIPs, particularly the mixed-use CIP, we've got 2 projects. We have 16 affordable ownership housing units that were created along Serena Drive. Those are now occupied. There's also 55 units under construction in the development along Green Lane. And when we looked at the units that were sold along Serena Drive, based on the deeds and the fact that no land transfer tax was paid, it would appear that some of those units were sold to first-time home buyers, which does allow some residents to get into the housing market. As I mentioned before, housing prices have risen dramatically. Low and medium density housing is really out of the reach of many, whereas apartments tend to be a bit less expensive. CIP grants can result in the construction of more affordable forms of housing. So as I mentioned before, parents don't have to move out and our children can get into the housing market. Next slide, please. So this is the Serena Drive property. There were 44 units created. 16 of those units were affordable ownership housing. So the developer created 36% of the units were considered as affordable. Under the CIP program currently that's in place for that property, the developer was required to provide a minimum of 20% of the units affordable. And at the time that the application was made, affordable ownership housing meant that the purchase price of the units had to come in under $308,000. So I'm now going to turn it back over to Lawrence.
Thanks, Kathleen. In the next few slides, I will talk a bit about the assessment value changes, both realized and estimated, along with the additional tax expected to be generated from these CIP investments. I would state the number of TIG projects that have been reassessed are limited. And for the outstanding ones, we're estimating the total assessment change. Next slide, please. The diagram or chart in front of you has a variety of information to consider or contemplate. It does not contemplate or consider what would have happened with no investment, i.e. had we not intervened. You can see with the blue line, if we simply relied on year-over-year assessment increases, the total assessment value increase would be minimal. This is like assuming that you keep a vacant property land consistent with its current application or the way it is today. When you look at the gray and yellow trend lines, you see that it takes about 10 years for you to recoup, 10 years plus to recoup your initial investment, with the expected increase in net taxes following. The bright orange line represents the total assessment increase for the properties. I would caution that we have limited financial data, i.e. actual assessment increases, so additional data points or actual assessments would be beneficial to validate the projections. Next slide, please. As noted, it's the long-range goal of the SIP programs is to increase the assessment values, and this is done through being strategic in how you plan and how you grow the community. As I indicated on the previous slide, we have limited data sets or results to draw from. 2 of the 9 projects have been recessed, and the others are at various stages. So we also looked at estimated assessment increases as well. The 7 projects not completed obviously are preliminary and may be above or below the estimates shown on the previous slide. I would point out though we have limited reassessed properties, the 2, the initial results or increase is positive. In fact, the assessed value average increase is about 164%. I'm hopeful as we go through this long process and as we gather additional information and data, we can validate the numbers by using other data sets from other municipalities if available. Next slide, please. So though sometimes the assessment is delayed, primarily impact timing, the taxes recouped by the town are retroactive to occupancy. On the previous slide, I indicated the assessment value increased by 164%, and the average increase in taxes collected increased by 277%. Again, This is on a limited sample size, so results may vary and the increase in property tax may be comprised of other factors and are primarily driven by the tax rate in a given year. We still expect, based on our internal estimate, that for the projects underway, we will see significant increase in property taxes once again. I would say these are estimates and the final numbers may be slightly different. When investing, there are a variety of ways to look at value. In this case, we looked at the payback period, i.e. when do we recoup our initial investment and when do we start to see positive returns? In this case, the payback period is approximately 13 years. And after this point, the investment would yield a positive return over the initial investment put forth for the CIP by the town. This approach does not consider other things like time value of money, but simply the net investment and the dollars recouped. Hopefully, as more projects come forward or are completed, we continue to see positive trends. Over to you, Kathleen.
Thank you. Can we, we'll just start at slide 32. So the reason we put these visuals in here is we want to show how these CIP grants can support our small businesses, whether it's a building improvement or a facade, and also influence development. In regards to housing, the market basically dictates what developers will build. We've got provincial policies that direct growth must be accommodated within Lincoln. And what that means is because it has to be within the existing urban boundary, because we have fixed urban area boundaries, we're surrounded by the Greenbelt. We also know that CIPs can influence certain environmental features such as green energy, whether it's solar panels or geothermal or green roofs. Other features like bike racks and indoor bike parking, LED lighting, better design of buildings and the site as well, improvements to the streetscape, and probably one of the most important things is affordable housing and new developments. They can also influence a type of development such as tourist accommodation, which is badly needed in this town. Over the years, we've had discussions with applicants for some who have small businesses, and they do appreciate the grants, and they advise us that it has assisted them in making some improvements to the buildings. Others have mentioned to us that without some of the incentives, they may not have been able to incorporate some of the design features, the environmental features, or provided some affordable housing. We know that this information is, at this time is very, very preliminary because as part of this process, we're going to be doing much more detailed stakeholder consultation. Can we go to slide 33, please? So this is a picture of basically a before and after picture. For those people who remember, this at one time was the former Rexall Pharmacy building, who built a new building on Ontario Street. It's now occupied by an optometrist and also has a coffee shop in it. So this particular applicants applied for a facade improvement grant to improve the front of their building, the side of their building that faces Ontario Street, and also the rear of their building because the rear faces North Lane. Next slide, please. This next property, which is the Midwife Clinic, they applied for a building and a facade improvement grant. And what we've shown here is the before and after pictures. They did some improvements, to their windows. They did some improvements to their landscaping. And they also did some environmental health and safety improvements to the interior of the building. Next slide, please. So the next slide shows a couple of new commercial developments. We have the development at 4322 Ontario Street and 5000 Serena Drive. Those created new businesses within the town. The next picture is 4083 Cave Springs Road, and there's a wine tasting and event space, and this is one of the first proponents of the Rural and Industrial Grant Program. Next slide, please. Okay, so this particular development is at 502 504 and 516 Serena Drive. So it's 3 buildings in total. The 2 end buildings are completely residential. The middle building is commercial on the ground floor and residential uses above. This particular development, as I mentioned previously, created 6 affordable housing units. Next slide, please. This particular property, which is on a 5082 Alyssa Drive, it's a care facility or a retirement home. Some of the design features, they added some parking lot plantings and screenings. They articulated the building. They provided indoor bicycle parking as well as scooter parking. They have some exterior bike racks. They did some rainwater harvesting. They have an EV charger in their parking lot. They put in place, probably going to pronounce this wrong, high albedo material on the roof. And what that does is a dark colored roof tends to attract a lot of heat. When you use a lighter type roof, it attracts less heat. They also did, there's a picture on the side of a landscape courtyard for the residents. Next slide, please. This particular property at 505 Green Lane Road, right next to Sobeys, and in very close proximity to a potential future GO station. This is a commercial residential mixed use project. This is probably, I would say, probably the largest project that's currently under construction. Some of the features of this building is the developer's building it to a LEED standard building, so he will have to get that certified. He's stepped back the building design. He's put in geothermal, which means that the heating costs of the people that buy these units will be less. Not actually as part of the CIP application, but later, the applicant decided to put in rooftop solar panels. The building has underground parking, and there is some surface parking at the side and the rear. One of the design guidelines is to hide parking as much as possible. He also put in a gray water system for irrigation. You can't tell from this picture, but it has a landscape courtyard. As well, this was also what I would call a former brownfield site, because at one time this was an industrial area. And this is the project that is proposing 55 affordable ownership housing units. Next slide, please. This particular property is right downtown at 5002 King Street. So what this developer has done, he's got a bit of a slight step building. He's got underground parking. This here as well was a former brownfield site. And as council will recall, it did sit empty for a long time while the applicant was cleaning up the property. And it's also now under construction. Next slide, please. So this project is on Ontario Street. It's at 4514 Ontario Street. It's also a mixed use proposal. They are going to use drought tolerant native species. The parking is at the rear of the building. They're going to be putting in some rooftop amenity space. And again, they're also using the high albedo material on the roof. Next slide, please. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to our CIO to talk about next steps.
Next slide, please. So I think as this slide highlights, and as I said at the beginning of the presentation, we are in the early stages. We will be in front of council at multiple opportunities, talking about and engaging with both council and the public on the various elements of the process and where we find ourselves, looking at our CIP review. Recommendations on the future form of any CIP will be recommended to committee, again, following, I think, best practices, reviews, and input. Overarching, I think what this slide really tries to show is a couple of things, really the intersection of all the things that council is working on and that fall within our priority documents, coupled with what we ultimately always hope is the benefit of any community improvement plan, and that is some of the basic economic tenets around investment in the community, new business, and job creation. And I think when you look at the vast array of community improvement plans we have, whether it be the rural community improvement plan or our industrial community improvement plan, which are some of the newer ones that we put together, job creation remains a key tenet, a key priority within them. Of course, improved variety of housing options. And again, what we call that housing attainability. Just this past week, I know there were conversations being had and that I was part of with community and social services at the region, really talking about what is the need here in Lincoln. And I think some of that information, again, will be presented. And so look forward to sharing that with members of council. Lawrence talked a little bit about assessment growth and new taxes generated, and we'll get more into that. And of course, the last example that Kathleen shared around brownfield lands and how they were cleaned up. Next slide. So again, a little bit about where we are and what are the multiple steps that we'll be taking in the report backs to council with a notice of decision coming in 2022 in the second quarter. So staff are here to answer any questions. All of the senior leadership team is available to answer the various questions council may have. And back to you, Mr. Chair, for the next phase in the conversation.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for the presentation from the entire team. So I will now open it up for council to have any questions or comments. Councilor Regima, go ahead, start us off.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is regarding an item in the report. So I'm just going to find where it is, but at some point near the beginning, it states that the development charge reduction grant is not available in the Beamsville CIP. It's a little note at the bottom on page 2 under the second chart, the second table. So I'm wondering if I can just get a little bit of outline about one thing, why that is. And another, I'm thinking particularly about the boundaries of the Beamsville CIP. I can't remember exactly what the boundaries are and what they look like, but maybe that DC reduction grant is available through the mixed use CIP, and maybe that might apply in certain areas. That's possible. But what I'm thinking really is that if there's areas within Beamsville that may benefit from that DC reduction grant being available, particularly for housing, as chair of the Housing and Homelessness Community Partnership Advisory Committee, that's what I'm thinking about right now. And for example, the BDSS site, is that something that if that were to be developed, and if that were a site that could have some form of quote unquote affordable housing on there, depending on how we end up defining that, would somebody be interested in, would somebody that is interested in developing in that area have access to either the development charge reduction grant or the tax increment grant? That's my question.
So there's a lot in that, Councilor Regima. I think if we go right back to the start, I think the question was about the Beamsville CIP and no longer having the TIG, was it? Or was it
the note says the DC reduction grant, the development charge. Yeah.
So let's start with that one, Kathleen, if you would respond to that, or if you've got all the question that Councilor Regima asked, you can just fire away. Go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will do my best. So the CIPs have evolved. So the very, very first CIP was the Beamsville CIP, and it did not offer the development charge reduction program. So the Vineland one was done a little bit later. It offered the development charge reduction program. And then when we look at the mixed use CIP, there's a little bit of overlap between what I would call the Vineland CIP and the mixed use CIP and the Beamsville CIP. And within certain areas, there is a development charge reduction grant. There was also some direction by council to only consider a development charge reduction grant through if they're providing particularly rental housing. The other question was, right now our community improvement plans they're very area specific. So for example, the Beamsville CIP covers your downtown area, a commercial section along Ontario Street. The Vineland CIP covers, downtown Vineland, and then the mixed use CIP covers what I would call some of the commercial areas that are overlapped with the other two CIPs. Plus, it also covers your high density areas. So it can be a little bit confusing. So what the focus is with a lot of newer CIPs is, rather than get into, say, area specific, and this is what I would say we've kind of done with the rural and industrial CIP, is we focused it not so much on this is the boundary, but focused it on particular types of land uses. So that's something that's going to be looked at as part of the review of this CIP.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I ask clarification questions, please?
Sure, go ahead.
So I understand that makes sense, that I read that in the report also, that we're going to consider consolidating them and clarifying them, and maybe not having specific boundaries that they apply to, but more describe the properties that would be subject to these incentives through types and okay. So one question: does the Beamsville CIP cover the BDSS site right now?
Kathleen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, it doesn't, because it just covers the Central Business District. The BDSS site is outside of the Central Business District.
Okay, thank you. And I have one more question, Mr. Chair.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And you refer to this in the report. When we approved the changes to the CIP incentives, and I think it was 2019, we asked that we look into methods for ensuring affordability. We asked that we look into ways of ensuring affordability by tying incentives to an agreement of some kind, that the units remain affordable, and that would be by our definition of affordable for a specific period of time. Have we come to any conclusions with that, or are we looking at doing that as part of this review?
Kathleen?
Through you, Mr. Chairman. So as part of this CIP review, one of the focuses will definitely be affordable housing. And that has been a concern, is we need to find ways, particularly if it's, for example, rental housing. You want to make sure that it's going to stay as affordable rental housing, for example, for a specified period of time. So this is something that staff is researching. We're looking at how other municipalities are doing it. Regional housing, for example, if they're providing grants, they do require a proponent to enter an agreement to ensure that the units remain affordable for a certain period of time. Typically, it's 20 years, but that is part of the review of the CIP.
So these incentives are available now, and there's nothing tying the incentives to ensuring that the units remain affordable for a long period of time. Is that correct, as it sits?
Currently, there is no requirement. So that is one of the things that needs to be looked at.
Okay, so we can talk about that more at our housing committee, because it sounds like something that that I'd really like to see brought onto the front burner and done as quickly as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Devan, was it Councillor Brene next?
It was.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through you to staff, thank you very much for this report. There's a lot of data here, but I really appreciate the work that's been done on it and look forward to the work that needs to be done over the next period of time to the Q2 of 2022. So I wanted to kind of continue along the path of Councillor Rinjima's comments. She put it on a tee, so I'll just continue to hit that ball down the fairway. You know, when we look at our official plan, you know, one of the first bullet points is to improve the supply of affordable housing and the range of housing opportunities. So currently, and maybe this can be through to Kathleen, you know, when I look at our current mixed use CIP, we require a minimum of 20% units to be classified as affordable. When I look at the breakdown of the Centerville, 16 out of 44, we're up to 36%. Utopia on Green Lane, we're 55 of 276 at 20%. You know, we're hearing from the regional housing suggesting a threshold up to 30%. Can we expect that through this review, we look at try to increasing that number from 20% up to a closer 30% threshold? Understanding that obviously there's a balance here, that if we push the developer too far, he's going to push back and maybe threaten not to give us any. But I'd like to see that number get up closer to 30%. I'd like to see if Kathleen could comment on that.
Kathleen, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as the councillor mentioned, within the mixed use CIP, the minimum threshold is 20%. We have had some discussions with regional housing, and they've given us the 20 to 30% range. Because when you do a project, you do want mixed use buildings. Part of our research that we're going to be doing is you know, looking to see, you know, what sort of thresholds other municipalities are doing. And also some further consultation with regional housing. As well, too, as part of this process, we're going to be doing some consultation with stakeholders. So, I mean, these are questions we can pose, you know, to the development community. So we want to make sure that whatever we recommend to staff, we're going to end up with some affordable housing. So we're definitely looking at this.
Councillor?
Okay, thank you. If I could continue, Chair.
Yes.
So my next question is the slide on Director Wagner spoke about where every dollar invested in our CIP generated or leveraged $8 of private sector. I recall back 2 or 3 months ago, we had a presentation and the presenter showed us CIPs and showed us leverage dollars in other municipalities, Kitchener, Waterloo, Sarnia. There was a number of different municipalities that were shown that night. I'm wondering, as we move forward with this, will we see charts that will show us how we're comparing? Because when I look at this number of $8, from my recollection of those municipalities, this number seems low. I don't have the other numbers but I remember being blown away that evening by the presenter on some of those numbers. So just wondering, are we going to be shown some comparators when we look at this CIP as we move forward?
Through to Kathleen or Director Wagner, or who would like to take on? Mr. Deanne?
Thank you, Chair McPherson, and you through you to the councillor. Good question. So councillor, you may remember the May 31st motion that Deputy Mayor Russell and a number of all the council supported. It did ask us to go through a little bit of some research in terms of benchmarking against some other municipalities. And as CEO Kpis sort of mentioned in terms of next step, some of that research we're currently doing and we'll be presenting back in Q4 of this year. So we're actually doing that research, and we'll be benchmarking some of those numbers. And you're absolutely right, Councillor, in terms of some of the other different municipalities did have some return on investment, some different numbers. You cannot obviously compare apples to apples when it comes to different communities, but we are going to be doing some of that benchmarking.
Right. And I think it's important to, make sure that whatever we're comparing, it's apples to apples. Because I remember that night, Councillor McPherson asking, was it appraised value? Was it assessed value? There was some comparators that weren't matching up. So I appreciate that, Mr. Deaney. I'm really happy to see, the brownfield developments that we're doing, the one on Green Lane, the Utopia project, and to see that this is a LEED certified project with solar panels and underground parking. I think this could be one of our best housing projects to date. And I'm just wondering, through you, Chair, to staff, have we identified, or do we have any other brownfield properties in Lincoln that we can be targeting as we move forward?
Through to Kathleen or Director Deaney.
Mr. Chairman, I'll try and answer that as best as I can. Unlike if we look at, some municipalities that had a sort of a manufacturing base, and I'm going to just use Hamilton as an example. That's one municipality that has an awful lot of brownfields. So one of the focuses of their CIPs is obviously cleaning up those brownfields. In the town of Lincoln, we do have some brownfield sites, but there aren't a lot of brownfield sites. So just to give you an example, I do know that there's one within the Prudhome's neighborhood, for example, that is proposed for future residential development, so that there are some sites out there. And sometimes too, as people are buying or selling properties, they do uncover things as a result of construction. So there are some brownfields out there, but we don't have a high proportion compared to what I would call more industrialized type municipalities.
If I could jump in there, Chair, just quickly. To the councillor. On the industrial side, a little bit more of our focus seems to be on underutilized industrial land. So not necessarily brownfield, but industrial land that could be better used for job creation and investment attraction. But just off the top of my head, in terms of some one big brownfield site that has been on my radar for a little bit is the vacant land in downtown Vineland that would be considered brownfield and ripe for redevelopment.
That's great. I only mention it, I've lived in the community my entire life, and I can remember as a young boy back in the early 70s, that was a piece of property that had sat vacant for many, many decades. And when the service roads were built and the bridges were built over top of the Queenie, there was a ready mix plant that set up on that property. And then the property sat vacant for decades and decades. And we're not getting any taxes from that. We're not getting anything. No value. And to think now that we've got 276 units creating a huge assessment for our property and the tax base is really something that I think we should be celebrating, those brownfield starts. So anyway, I wouldn't ask any, I think I'm at my limit, Council Chair, and I thank you for the report.
Thank you, Councillor. And Devan, who is next?
We have Deputy Mayor Russell.
Deputy Mayor, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I do have a few questions. I will ask my three, and then I will go back to the end of the queue, just because I know that's the proper process. I want to thank staff for bringing this forward. Again, I'm trying to be as open-minded when reviewing this report. I know that back in 2011, when the first CIP was created, it was a different world. Lincoln was different. The Niagara region was different. Everything has changed very quickly over the last several years. And I think it's hard to argue as well about the benefits of the facade improvement CIPs, the rural CIPs, brownfield CIPs that Councillor Brennan alluded to. Again, I think those are all worthy endeavors. I think the real critical eye always should be, for me anyway, is on that other residential multi-use. And for me, the big elephant in the room is when I look at this report, it looks like we are essentially comparing it in a vacuum or creating it in a vacuum. And I look at all the success measures and the KPIs, and I look to our neighbor 3 kilometers to the east in Grimsby, and I see that they are doing everything that we are measuring against without CIPs and without that residential subsidy. So they have more projects completed over the last several years. They have businesses created in those multi-use as multi-use, jobs created, different types of housing, assessment increases, taxes increased. They now have green technology included. I don't know if anybody saw the geothermal announcement last week that is not part of a CIP. Also by a developer that is one of our developers here in Lincoln, all achieved without any resident subsidies. So my question to Director Dale is, with that being so close to us, the same developers, basically the same geography, why do people in Lincoln have to subsidize the developments here and not there?
Kathleen?
So I think I'll answer some of the questions, but I will probably defer to Mr. Deanny in regards to the economic impact and things like that. But Grimsby does have some CIPs. It is focused on their downtown area. I think the whole point of CIPs is we may get development, it may be delayed, but really, I think the key issue is do we want to take that development and put it in the direction that we want to see, whether that's getting some additional environmental features, getting some affordable housing, improving the urban design. Really, those are the focus of the CIPs is trying to get your development in the direction that you want to see that aligns with council priorities.
Councillor?
I wasn't sure if Director Deanny was going to comment as well.
Oh, sorry. Mr. Deanny.
No problem, Chairman, and through you to the councillor. And I'll make a quick comment. I think I'll turn over to the CAO as well. I mean, at the end of the day, councillor, our community improvement plans are about shaping the community we want. And obviously it's about sort of attaining some of the things that we want to see out of the development. So as you'd mentioned, more commercial, some green lead buildings, and some potential affordable housing as well. And so, at the end of the day, it's really about shaping the community we want, especially when it comes to the jobs and the investment and creation of businesses and such. And so, I'm sure as we go through some of our review and benchmarking against other municipalities, we'll be answering some of those questions. But we look forward to that discussion as well. But I know the CAO wants to make a few comments.
Mr. CAO.
Through Mr. Chair to the councillor, and councillor, I think you make good points, and I think anytime we have an ability to look to those around us, we should. One of the things that council will have heard me say on numerous times is I don't just like to look within the Niagara region. I think our topography, I think our community, what it looks like, its composition, the desirability of what we want to bring here to our community is different than Grimsby. I'm not by any means slagging our neighbors to the west, but I also don't think in reviewing community improvement plans that a one size fits all approach is as effective. What works or what we may want to incentivize in one community may not be effective in another. And I think we're hearing part of the conversation tonight around brownfield, something that Grimsby really doesn't have a lot of. I know the developer you're referencing as it relates to some of their green infrastructure, some of their geothermal, and I think we're expanding that and looking at that. I think as we've said tonight, community improvement plans can be economic development tools, but they need to be aligned with our economic development strategies, which may be different than Grimsby's, with all due respect to Grimsby's. And so I think we need to cater ours to support an affordable housing threshold. I think you've heard us talk about tonight, a climate and green threshold, again, that is likely different than our neighbors to the west. It is about targeting kind of the sectors we want to look at. But I mean, I highlight that I think you raise a good point and something that we're going to look at, but I think you're going to hear from more than that. If I look at affordable housing, community improvement plans, I can rhyme off, I think, every municipality in the province from Peterborough to Belleville, to Barrie to the Blue Mountains to Sudbury to Midland, Smith Falls, large, small, are all doing them. And that's not to say because everyone else is doing them, we should, but I think we need to be very, very specific over what our program will be. So just a few comments.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Next question goes to Director Wagner. I believe Director Dale mentioned the changing priorities in one of her slides. And one of the things that we are seeing as part of our budget process is what looks like a likely long-term trend in increase of costs associated with our capital projects. And one of the offsetting results of that is either down the road, we either have less capital projects for our residents, or we look to increase revenue, which would either be by increasing the levy on our taxes, or potentially reviewing and bringing back some of this, or sorry, reviewing these CIPs and trying to get as much revenue out of them as possible. So with that being said, how do you foresee the spend that we're giving to our CIPs in terms of overall budget long-term impacts?
Oh, this is an interesting question because it's funded largely from the NPI dividends, and those come into generally if you look over the next year or two, they cover most of the costs with a small piece on the levy. If we increase the number of CIPs going out, obviously then it has an impact on the levy. That said, if the assessments continue to go up and there is an increased investment, that you create critical mass, that you draw in additional investment, it can keep your levy impact relatively flat. It's kind of you build it and then more people come, you build that critical mass, it can tend to increase the revenue without increasing the levy or the cost to the existing taxpayers. So right now, over the next year or two, we seem to be fine. As we go, I expect if these things pan out the way they're looking over the longer term, that the net impact or the payback period will yield us a positive result. We're going to have a tipping point where we have to monitor and watch, and it's something I have on my radar to look at over the next year. Actually, it's along with reserves. It's along with the what we will present at the budget presentation about fiscal sustainability. So it all ties together, and we will keep an eye on this.
Okay, thank you, Director Wagner. Through you, Mr. Chair, my last question on this round. Back to Director Wagner, it was actually a good segue. I'm wondering if you can provide us either as an addendum after this meeting, not immediately after, because I know it'll take a bit of time, but maybe as part of the next presentation, a historical reference to what the Lincoln portion of the tax levy increase has been since CIPs have started in 2011 until last year. So by year, so what has been our levy increase as a percentage for Lincoln's share since CIPs were introduced?
Through you, Chair McPherson, to Councillor Russell, for sure. I definitely can do that. We actually did that as part of the exercise. Obviously, the assessment, as I indicated in the presentation, the changes are dependent on impact adjustments. So whatever I have, I definitely can go back as far as I can for that period of time, and we'll definitely include it in the next presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'll come back.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Councillor Timmers, I believe, Devan? Councillor Timmers, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair McPherson. So questions are around affordable housing as well, and there's already been, some discussion around that. My question is regarding page 14 of the report, where there's comments regarding their targets. So saying that we had met our targets, although there still is a need for affordable housing. So I'm just wondering, maybe through to Ms. Dale, we will have to rework and look at all of our targets moving forward, especially around the affordable housing, because it seems to me there's going to be a major increase with what's been happening in the climate with real estate and COVID and unemployment rates. And if you would just comment regarding the targets and how we will be looking at setting those.
Kathleen?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So really where this comes from is when the mixed use CIP was done. At that time, the consultant that we retained looked at, potential development activity and how many units would likely apply, for the grant programs. So based on the numbers provided by the consultant, we have created quite a few, apartments and smaller multiple units. But the difficulty is if we look at the report that was presented to council back in December, where we're really falling short is we don't have a lot of rental accommodation. We don't have affordable rental accommodation. We also don't, if you look at our housing prices, they've gone crazy everywhere. Our house prices have gone way up. Everything, like even for somebody trying to buy a house, it's very, very difficult. So affordability is whether it's a rental unit or an ownership unit for a first-time home buyer, that really is an issue. And as part of the work that the Housing Task Force is going to be doing is the region has updated some of its growth numbers to 2051. So we as staff are going through that information and hoping to provide some updated information to the Housing Committee. So definitely, yeah, there's a possibility that some of those targets that were presented back in December may actually go up.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Ms. Dale. My other question is, again, around the affordable housing piece that I've always had a lot of difficulty with is the definition of affordable housing. And what is the definition, and what are the developers who are coming forward and saying, we're going to provide this many, this many units, they're going to be affordable housing. But what are they basing that on? And how does one actually acquire one of those affordable units? Because I personally know people who have been trying to get one of these units in the new builds and they've not been successful. So what is the process? Like who is front of the line to acquire one of these affordable housing units? And then when the build is done and they see their property is increased 100,000, there's no stopping them from flipping it, or somebody walking in, picking up a couple of these affordable units, never actually living in them, and then just selling them for a profit. Like some of the units down on Green Lane are now $500,000 for an apartment. So I think we really need to look at that and the definition. And I heard an agreement, as someone had said, perhaps we need an agreement. We need something moving forward with, and I totally support incentivizing affordable units because we need them badly and our numbers are climbing. Ms. Dale, do you have any comments around how we could enforce it, or how do these units, how do they get sold? What's the process?
Yeah, so in response to your question, Councillor, with a lot of these developments, usually what happens is the developer starts selling them long before they actually start construction. So by the time the building's under construction, most of the units are sold, which makes it difficult for people to buy those units. I do agree that that with affordable housing, there needs to be some more controls in place to ensure that it remains affordable. That is definitely something we need to look at. It's definitely much easier for rental accommodation because you're dealing with usually, one particular owner who's renting a number of units. It is a bit more difficult with the affordable housing, but it is something that we have to look at. There are some positives with some affordable ownership units. It does allow some people to get into, the housing market and build up equity. But it's not uncommon for people to buy a condominium unit. By the time it's ready to sell, they've assigned it to somebody else. As well, when it comes to these affordable housing units, they had to provide us with copies of the deeds to show the purchase price. that it meets the definition of affordable housing, which is provided by the region. On a go forward basis, the region, there's a provincial policy statement definition that talks about 30% of your income. But where the region is going is it's not just 30% of your income, but it's 30% of your costs of operating the house. So whether that's, your rent or your mortgage or condo fees and your utilities. So the 30% is really more of an all-in number. What's been used in the past is just the 30% of the price of the home.
It needs to include all of your expenses.
I have Mr. CAO would like to make a comment. Go ahead, Mike.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the councillor. So, councillor, I think it's a good question in terms of how do we keep them affordable. I'm going to harken back to a comment Kathleen made earlier that really came out of the conversation with Niagara Regional Housing, and that is when we look at affordable housing, and I think when we start to mature in that affordable housing space, we need to either partner with a group like Niagara Regional Housing, or we need to partner with someone who's going to create affordable housing and actually run and maintain a facility, a space, a building as affordable housing. And then with that comes the necessary agreements that would be put in place. It's not just simply about building a unit, having a couple of affordable housing units in it. That's definitely one way to go. And I think we can strengthen the agreements we have. But there are other models. And I think, again, as we mature in the affordable housing realm, we need to look at those other options. I think, another element that I'm not sure has, been mentioned, and I think we talk about market and where the market's at. The objectives of CIPs and what we hope to achieve is not just about, a green building like we've talked about, and others are doing it without a CIP, but it's about the commercial development. And what we're seeing a lot more of is things like community facilities. So making sure there's community space, child and senior care spaces within that facility. One of the comments that stuck with me, Mary Easton can attest to this, Kathleen can, when we were speaking with the region, and that is we need to all understand what is the formulaic exercise that goes into creating either any form of housing, not just affordable housing, but housing in general. What it costs to procure goods to build a house, what it costs to pay the labor to build a house. And then once we start understanding those sorts of things, and for those of us that went on a tour, about half a council, and met with an affordable housing provider a number of years ago, there's associated costs that go along with housing. And I think often when you look at a community improvement plan, it's those particular pieces that we have a potential of impacting, whether it be the fees that are paid to planning staff, or whether it be development charges, or all the other fees that go into creating homes and creating units and creating rental opportunities. So I think, again, as we start to learn more, we need to, ensure we actually understand the process. And hearing a social services provider like Adrian Jugley, who's the commissioner at the region, talk about pro formas, to me was a very telling tale in terms of understanding what is required to provide housing. It's not a simple, what goes in comes out, ROI, great terms to throw out, but it's a far more complex exercise than all of that. So I do want to leave that, with members of council in terms of where we're at right now. But there are other things we're looking at, and we are comparing. If I look at who's best in class, the Kitchener-Waterloos, the Cambridges, other municipalities that have, I think similar topography, similar types of rural populations is who we need to look at. So thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Councillor Timmers, are there any other questions?
I just real quick, Chairman Person, very happy to see this report. It's a great report. And I wonder about the business facades. The uptake is pretty low, and the heritage restoration and grant, that we've had a couple there. And I'm hoping maybe through this process with public engagement that people will be more aware, and some of the downtown businesses will be more likely to take advantage. So I just wanted to put that out to staff. I'm sure you've already thought of that, but anyway, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And Councillor Mikulik. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair McPherson. Through you to staff. In listening to Councillor Timmer's comments, I'm going to go down the same path. What I'm gathering is that we are incentivizing affordable builds, affordable condominium new construction, but we don't know who the buyers are. We don't know who the actual person or individual is that's benefiting from this new build. Yet we're still incentivizing. Should we consider suspending that until we come up with a better metric of who is actually receiving the benefit of that affordable condominium? Should we implement a moratorium, so we are able to determine who is actually receiving the benefit of that first-time buyer?
Mr. CAO, I see your name or your hand is up.
Through you, Mr. Chair, to the council. I think my hand was up before. I don't know if anyone else is going to chime in. I mean, Councillor, I think my only comment would be I would never rush into a moratorium of any sort until we analyze fully the implications of that for a whole wide array of reasons. So, I mean, something definitely staff can consider and provide a much more fulsome response for council. But I don't think whether that moratorium be on waste facilities or anything of the such that people often use moratoriums for, I think I'm always cautious to say that's a direction to go while we seek data and while we seek data around the potential of how we identify who home buyers are. I think that's a very complex undertaking. And again, I think as we mature as an organization and within the realm of affordable housing, it's not necessarily knowing who the person is buying the unit, but making sure we have a process in place to ensure that unit stays affordable, irregardless of who's buying it, irregardless of their personal income situation. There are appropriate, I think, checks and balances that are put in place, whether it be Niagara Regional Housing or other housing providers that do that sort of work. And I think that's where we need to leave it. As a municipality, as a government, I understand what you're saying. If we're going to give money to a particular development, what is the end result of that development, and how do we ensure we protect our investment, so to speak, as you're characterizing it, Councillor? But I think, again, we'd have to look at what is the process set up to do that. And so I'm cautious anytime the word moratorium is thrown around for anything, but I'll look to, I see Lawrence's hand up. He may want to chime in on that piece as well.
I would
Go ahead.
Council Chairman McPherson to Councillor Mikulik. I don't know how the mechanics would work on that, to be quite honest with you. The purchasers, but because the transaction is conducted by a third party, so a builder or whoever, to sell the unit, you're actually asking a third party to assess the criteria, set up the criteria, and we're actually you would essentially ask the town to mandate for them to do extra work and to do that kind of assessment. I don't think it's something that external businesses would have the capacity or the desire to do. So suspending it at this point, I don't know if it makes sense because we don't have enough information. I do agree with Mike. We have to take a more fulsome look at this and kind of come back to it to see what's in the realm of doable. But if the intent is to provide lower price homes, it's not something I can see that would be easily ascribed to or accepted to by the builders who are trying to incent to build in our community. They would just simply go somewhere else and potentially look to build somewhere else. And I still don't know about the feasibility of such request.
Those answers. I throw that question out there because, as Councillor Russell had mentioned earlier, neighboring municipalities don't have incentives for this sort of construction. So, would it, that's not what unless I'm wrong, unless I'm incorrect in that statement.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I could, I think, I think the comment I'll make is you're correct that one does, Councillor. I think it's, when we look at public engagement and being as authentic and transparent with the public as we can, I don't like to just highlight one example. Every other municipality in Niagara has them. One does not. I guess you could look at Wainfleet, but there isn't an ability to actually develop within Wainfleet. So I think we just need to be cautious when we say, let's do X because everyone else is doing it, when it's not everyone else. So for me, there's a cautionary note there. I think we need to go through the engagement process, which is really next. And like I said, we've already been engaging residents. I think the conversations we've had over the last number of days have been positive, have been fruitful. I think from a staff perspective, it gives us things to look at and an ability to, I think, create and tailor options for council moving forward. But I'd just be cautious to say no one's doing them because I don't think that's that's fair to the public who may be watching.
Okay. Thank you very much. Through you, Chair, I'll move on to my next question. Incentives, my understanding, grants, this sort of thing, is to promote or, stimulate growth, encourage growth, and, based on the report. Given the fact that the town of Lincoln does not have a lot of developable land that we've been told, are we in a rush to develop? Is there a rush? Is there a sense of urgency to rush? And if we are rushing, is there a possibility that we're rushing and constructing or developing what may not be best? Is there that possibility in incentivizing? Or is that a question that's just about impossible to answer?
But through you, Mr. Chair, why don't I start and then I'll turn it over to maybe planning staff. I would say, Councillor, the process we often take as staff is we are an intake agency, and regardless of whether we have a CIP or not, I think there's definitely interest in the community. Again, I'm going to go back to, a CIP program, the way I think staff intend to come back to you and present is not to say development, yes, development, no, CIP goes no to yes. I think we know a development's coming. And as we go through the negotiation with a potential developer and say, you know what, climate change is an issue, childcare space is an issue, senior care space is an issue. How do we work with that particular developer or business owner to ensure that what they're building as additional amenities, which may not generate income, are included in that particular development? So I think that's how we look at it. It's not about rushing, not rushing, in terms of what we're doing. I wish I could tell you we could slow down, and that tsunami, I think, as people describe it, coming from the GTA, isn't going to impact us. It's either going to impact us and we're ready for it, or it's going to envelop us and continue down the peninsula. And so I think my philosophy, the philosophy we as staff have always said to council, is we need to be ready for it. We need to be able to negotiate and get a better end product. And I think that's why we have them. But I see Director Bruder's hand up. He could probably talk to it more from a planning perspective than I.
Director Bruder.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think, Mike probably touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to touch on. It's not about rushing at all. I mean, we process development applications as we come in. Believe me, we take them very seriously. And the last thing we want to do is rush things through. We want to always take a fulsome look at things, make sure they fit into the community as best they can. But with CIPs, I don't think, you in your opening comment to that question or opening portion of it, you were talking about encouraging growth. And that's what CIPs are for. In some cases, yes, I don't think we're necessarily talking about that here. I think we're also talking about is, we're enhancing quality of the development that we know is coming. We're trying to be strategic as to where it's located, what we want in it. And as to Mike said too, some of it is not necessarily, maybe it's not revenue generating for the developer. So it's an opportunity to try to encourage those types of development that are also needed within the community. So again, Mike touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to, but those are the 2 cents that I would add. Thanks.
Councillor Mikulak.
Thank you very much. I'll ask him one more question. Again, difficult question to answer, but through you to Director Deanne, those slides, those developments that you pointed out or demonstrated in your presentation, are any of those new builds or construction developments, would any of them not occur had we not incentivized them in some way?
Director Deanne?
Thanks, Chair, and through to the councillor. If I recall correctly, councillor, I think you were referring to slide 24 that did talk about some commercial mixed use. And I mean, unfortunately, councillor, it's not easy. I think you alluded to it yourself. It's not an easy question to answer because truthfully, I don't think we don't know. But what we do know is that the types of development that we got and the incentives that we put into them, for example, the mixed use, we got commercial space out of it. And I think you've heard me say before that our community lacks commercial space. And it's encouraging when developers come through the door and we speak to them, encourage more commercial development in our community. That way we can have more businesses opening up, we can have more jobs created, and we can have more locations for residents to shop at. So from my perspective, anything that supports commercial development in our community is a win-win for myself.
All good. Councillor Mikulik?
Yeah, no, I do appreciate development, new builds. I do appreciate commercial. I do understand that, without some incentivization of some sort, it might not occur. However, I just want to make sure for myself that we're not incentivizing development that may already would have occurred. That's what I'm trying to make sure of. So thank you very much.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Councillor Petrieva.
Thank you, Chair McPherson. Now I've got the unstable internet connection, so I'll try to zip through this. So my first question, and I think there's a couple salient points from the report, and thank you very much. On page 4 that funding for the mixed-use CIPs has been discontinued for medium density because of the market demand for townhouses and multiple unit types. So we're only funding apartments and more affordable. So I think that puts to bed a myth that's out there that we're handing out money hand over fist. And then the other one is on page 5, and Councillor Timmers touched on it, and Councillor Bernay touched on it, and Rinchima. It's all about the affordability, right? And the Centerville project demonstrated, 35% affordable units. So, to increase that target and to maintain the affordability for, say, a 20-year time frame, and maybe the switch is working with those developers who that's what they do. The Indwells, the Niagara Regional Housing, so then they can maintain that affordable housing stock. So my question would be, and it's probably to Mr. Wagner, with the increase in the mixed use commercial and industrial, doesn't that somewhat shift the tax burden from the residential? Because knowing that mixed use and industrial is a higher rate.
Through your Chairman McPherson to Councillor Petrieva, yes, you're correct. So if you shift, is no different than having vacant land or farmland shifting to residential. Different property types yield different returns, and commercial industrial would yield a greater return than a residential property. So in essence, if you have the same property that was once residential to change to commercial industrial, we would generate a greater return, assuming the assessment value is obviously the same as it was before. The tax rate or the tax rate applied to it is greater than the residential side. So yes, it would increase.
Okay. And then through you, Chair McPherson, my second point would be, or again, question to Mr. Wagner. And Councillor Bernay touched on a little bit on the, $1 investment turns $8 of return, but developers aren't building $1 or we're not investing $1 and they're not building $8. So we're talking millions. So the construction. So it's a multiplier that's out there that increases, correct? Which again, then raises the value of a brownfield, which was generating nothing to, you pointed these out, 2,000 and 3,000% more, correct?
Chair McPherson to Councillor Patrick, that is correct. I would also caution to say that the type of investment, obviously the price of investment or the projects go up. As you can see from Jordan Village as an example, the cost for building goes up. So hence your leveraged dollar, because the investment itself is going up as a base. That said, depending on the types of projects, you can skew the number and it can increase because you're selecting different types of projects which have a greater investment in the community. It's on a limited sample that we're looking at, and over a longer period, that number may shift and increase to get to more where Councillor Brunet was referring to earlier. So with time, we may see an adjustment up. With time, we will see increase in project costs going up, which will increase the leverage dollar amount. So in essence, it should go up to a greater number.
Counselor? Did we lose you?
I think he is having internet
I
problems.
think we may have. So we can always come back to Councillor Pachariva. We're going to then go to, I see Councillor Brunet and Deputy Mayor Russell have raised their hand again, but I do have Mary Easton for the first time, so I will give Mary Easton the option to go now.
All right, Mr. Chairman, I wouldn't mind waiting for the councillors. They may have some continuity and with their questions, so I'll wait until after Deputy Mayor. Thank you very much.
Very good. We will go back to Councillor Pachariva, who has come back from the stars.
I'm muted. That might have something to do with my position and what's happening. That's with my internet. So, and of course, I've lost my train of thought because of the kicking out. So I think, you know what? Oh, actually, third point, and a question to Mr. Bruder and Ms. Dale. And I know that the Prudham's CIP is on hold right now, pending review. But in your professional opinion, as both as planners, without that in place, like that gives the town the ability to help steer the type of development they want to see. Without a CIP, a developer would come and build a megalopolis of townhouses and back-to-back garden homes and you name it, correct? So with this in place, we're allowed to kind of steer on what we want to see, a Main Street development, innovation with Silva cells, like, because the developer is going to build the cheapest unit they can, correct? In simplest terms.
Through you, Mr. Chair, maybe I'll start. Generally speaking, I mean, yes, we have our secondary plan in place, which does have some design guidelines and things of the like. But yeah, if you want to get, you know, the best quality in terms of your built form, if you want to have maximized use of low impact development and green infrastructure over and above, you know, applying geothermal is one thing, but there's a whole slew of other things that can be included on properties that can be advantageous to the whole development too, not just even within that specific area, you know, but just in the general area as well. So if you want all that, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, having a community improvement plan in place for that particular location does definitely assist staff in making sure that we achieve those lofty goals and get the best product we can in that area.
Councilor Pachariva?
I'm good, thank you.
Oh, good, thank you. Who was next? Is it Councilor Brunet?
Yes, it was.
Councilor Brunet.
Thank you, Chair McPherson, for the opportunity to ask another couple questions. So I did want to go on to Prudham's as well, but before I did that, I just want to ask a question to staff. So as a lower tier government in a two-tier government, you know, we always hear that the region, you know, kicks in with incentives along with what we're doing. I'm reading in the report that the region is currently going through a review of their incentives. You know, and we're hearing occasionally more and more, the region seems to be scratching their head on which pocket the money's coming from. Is there a concern to staff have any concern at this point that the region could be changing their thoughts on matching our incentive contributions moving forward?
Who would like to take that from staff? Mr. CAO.
Mr. Chair, I do see Kathleen's hand up, so why doesn't she start? And I know this has come up at a few regional CAO meetings, so I can also chime in.
Sure. Kathleen?
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, so the region is reviewing its CIPs, and they are refocusing them on things like affordable housing, employment, public realm improvements, and brownfields redevelopment. So they are looking at refocusing those CIPs. Currently, with some of our CIPs, things like, you know, for your facade improvements or your building improvements, the region will provide, you know, 25% of the cost. We provide 25% of the cost, and the applicant pays the other 50%. And then there's a cap. They are looking at eliminating the matching funding for some of these smaller grants, particularly building improvement and facades. So this is something that we are going to have to look at. There are some of our CIPs, they don't provide any matching funding at all. So for example, our rural and industrial CIP, those are all funded by the town. There's no matching funding provided by the region. For our mixed use CIP, they don't provide any matching incentives. They do, under their development charges bylaw, which is a separate program, provide some matching fundings for certain things if they meet SNP criteria. So as I mentioned in the report, the region's report has actually just come out. Their recommendation is to refer it back to the local municipalities. So as part of the region's review, staff are looking at reviewing that in much more detail now that the report is out, and coming back with some recommendations to committee.
Through you, Mr. Chair, if I could just add to Kathleen's comments, you know, is there a concern that the region will get out of the community improvement plan business? No. But are they doing what I would say we are doing right now? Yes. And I think we're spending a lot of time this evening focusing on the CIPs we currently offer. I think we are all acknowledging the region and theirs, ours and ours, that we do need to reshape them. Do we think in some very specific areas they're necessary in terms of the streams that the region's identified or the streams that we are going to be bringing forward? Yes. But I think in its current format, we all agree, as does the region, they need to change. So I did want to say that, but to your question, Councillor Brunet, are we worried the regions is going to get out of that business? No, it's just going to, I think, do what we do and take a much more surgical approach to the type of program it offers. And as for prudence, Councillor, I think you mentioned it. I think both Director Bruder and I, you know, have always said that on that development, we don't anticipate incentivizing residential development. It's really around some of those commercial opportunities we want and some of the green infrastructure. Again, it'll be a very surgical approach to what we come back with in totality. And it's not just about Prudhome's, it's about the entire municipality. Any sort of development needs to have a look at some of these green initiatives or some of those things around childcare and senior care we mentioned, or rental units. So that will be the approach we take, I think, across the board. Thanks for your time, Councillor, or your question, not your time.
So, so I appreciate all those comments. I asked that question only because I want to ask a question specifically about Prudhome's. So we all agree, you know, that we want this to be a destination. We want it to have exceptional urban design. We want it to have, you know, exceptional waterfront recreational amenities. And, you know, we want some sustainability in the development. So agreed that we're probably maybe going to have to look at some CIPs for some of the higher density. But I'm wondering through the staff, Chair, you know, when the developer bought the property, and as we sit here now today in 2021 with still no shovel in the ground, what are the expectations from the town of Lincoln and from the developer on what contributions the region of Niagara, if any, will be making to the Prudence development?
Do we have a hand raised? I don't see one. Mr. CAO.
Through you, Mr. Chair. Again, I'll start that. I know Director Bruder's been in conversations with the region on a number of elements. You know, I think early on in the process, you're right, Councillor. There is definitely a brownfield element to this site. And so I think there were some initial conversations with the former Commissioner of Planning at the region as it pertains to that. I think similar to the type of program that they're going to offer moving forward, and that is those programs around affordable housing, green infrastructure, and so forth. That's really where the conversation is happening. There will be a lot of, I think, toing and froing on the type of recreational and waterfront amenities we want there, public access to the beach and the waterfront in that particular location. And how do we maximize everything from community benefits that come with that particular proposal to the other things, you know, within the planning toolkit, for lack of a better word, that allow us to achieve those, I think, incredible opportunities in that destination we want to create there. The region is definitely a partner in that. There's some infrastructure that the region will be updating at its own cost. There will be development charges that the region receives to cover some of those particular elements. But the region is very much, both from a design perspective and a servicing perspective, aligned with the town. And I would suggest that the developer and their partners are aware of what are the limitations that the municipalities and the region have in terms of offering that type of support. But I think Matt can maybe talk to you a little bit about, again, the conversation as we go from secondary plan at a high level to more of the detailed work that we're undertaking. And the market has changed in a number of years, and that's both to the benefit of the particular developer, and I think in some ways to the benefit of the town in this particular instance. So, Matt?
Yeah, sure. Just to add on to that, you're totally right, Mike, and we've had a lot of conversations with the region about this in terms of where they're going with their review. You're right about the affordable housing piece, the rental housing piece. Those are going to be key factors, you know, and something that the region will probably look at when it comes to this area as well. But we have been in communications with them about that. We've also been in communications with the developer, who's also well aware of where the region's at in terms of their reviews of their incentive programs as well. We've been in communications with the region about their infrastructure, about upgrades that are going to be needed on things just as you know, for example, the North Service Road, including, you know, making it more urbanized, providing a better pedestrian experience and all these things. So these are conversations that we continue to have with the region, but the developer's been looped into, and they definitely know, as Mike said, the limitations in constraints that both, you know, we have as the town and the region as well.
Okay, that's great. I appreciate the comments both from the CEO as well as the Director of Planning. I only asked the question, you know, because, you know, we're getting growth targets from the province to 2041 and beyond to 2051 now. And, you know, we keep hearing people talk about densification and growth and going up. And I don't know what the number is and what Prudence is going to be when we finally start that project, but you know, it makes up a large percentage of the growth that Lincoln is going to go through over the next 20 to 30 years. And what did we always hear? You only get one chance to do it right. So I don't know, 3,500 to 5,000 people going into Prudence, that's a big number. So that's why I asked the questions, and I appreciate the responses. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. And we're now off to Deputy Mayor Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Glad to be back in. I've got a few questions. Some of them are pretty quick. I'm not sure if it would be to Director Wagner or to Director Dale. The first one is around the Serena project that was highlighted as far as affordable housing goes. Can we get some data points on that too? And I'll be very specific. We have the average of the affordable housing units, the sale price of them. Can we also get included for either the next report or as an addendum, the average of the other units that were not deemed affordable? And then also get what the total contribution will be from either DC charges or CIPs to that project. And what I'm trying to find out is what value are our residents getting to make sure that our contribution isn't more than the difference between those two values. So just want to find out what the overall value back to our residents is. So again, getting the average price of the other units, the average price of the ones that were sold for affordable housing, and then our overall contribution for CIPs and for DC charge rebates. Second question, and this would go to probably Mr. Director Bruder. Is it possible to get the number of units from, I'm just going to use an example as Utopia, and find out how many units that were sold originally as part of the initial sell have flipped or will flip before opening and move-in, just to try to find out the range of overall speculation that's happening in the market. Is that possible?
Mr. Bruder, or was that through to Mr. Bruder?
I believe so, or it could be Director Dale. I don't know who has those relationships with those developers to find out what the sale activity is, but trying to find out number of units that were sold initially, and then by the time we're move-in ready, how many of them will have changed hands at obviously a higher price to kind of show what the speculation rate is.
So, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to try and answer this the best I can. I'm not in the real estate market, so I don't have the answers to all of these. But, and I know there's a lot more rules regarding, assigning your purchase and stuff like that. I mean, we can ask the developer, but I don't know that we can make him provide that information. In regards to the Centerville development, we only asked for the deeds for the properties that were deemed affordable. We can, through various means, get the deeds of the rest of the properties. We just have to do a title search. We won't be able to provide a lot of final figures because that's one of the properties, although it's been occupied for probably well over a year, it's not fully reassessed. So that was the problem that Lawrence was mentioning is based on the applications, when they do a tax increment financing grant, for example, they're required to get an MPAC assessment to show what the future assessment's going to be. So we have those figures, but when they haven't reassessed all of the properties, like when I looked at it recently, they'd only reassessed part of the property, so they haven't fully reassessed the entire development. And it's probably because it's got a mixture of residential and commercial, and I suspect that some of the residential units may have been sold sooner than some of the commercial, so that might be why they haven't reassessed it. And there's all sorts of different occupancies, so I think it's just we may not be able to get all of that data because we don't really have the full reassessment.
Okay, thank you, Director Dale. And I know Director Wagner is a pretty bright guy. Maybe he can extrapolate as best he can. We'll put a big asterisk next to it just to know that it's an estimate, not necessarily the firm numbers, and I think that will suffice.
I do know the estimate numbers.
Okay, perfect. My next question, it goes back to prudence, and I'm glad to hear that. Again, whatever CIP is being, I guess, I know it's on pause, but is being considered is not going to be on the residential side. It's going to be more or less on that, as our CAO mentioned, that surgical strike of kind of infrastructure, potentially green initiatives, that type of thing. Do we have any measures in place to, again, going back to the value aspect of this, to verify what the cost would be, plain Jane, what the developer would put in, what we're putting in, and to ensure that we're only paying the difference between the two, not the entire full tilt. So like if he was going to put in a regular HVAC system and we're saying, no, you need to put in geothermal, are we paying the entire geothermal, or are we subtracting what his traditional HVAC system would be? And that's just an example. I'm not using that specifically, but do we have that process in place? And also, do we get the records back from the developers to verify that?
Through you, Mr. Chairman, why don't I take a stab at that? And Councillor, I think the way we're going to develop the program is very much the way you're using it. I think that illustrative example, albeit a very granular, simple example, really is the way I think we're going to do it. Is that here, here is what a base cost would be to do things in X. If we want X plus 5, the delta is really what we're paying or what we're incentivizing. I would suggest it's not even fully paying for it. It's incentivizing it in order to get that better product. Because I think then when you go to market and you tell someone, we've got geothermal, your increased energy or your energy costs are going to be decreased, you're not going to see the same increases, that then becomes a selling feature. And I think if you look at some other municipalities that have tried to do things around the geothermal, that becomes a selling piece. And so for us, I think any way we design a program is definitely not going to be covering the entire cost. And I'm going to suggest, again, going out on a limb, I'm not the expert here. It's a conversation that Matt, Lawrence, Kathleen, and others, I think, are going to bring to the table. It's very much going to be around, okay, what do we think encourages them enough to move in that direction, to do some more of this, innovative approach, to have more mature trees, to look at these things that maybe aren't typical. And so, I'll look to Matt to maybe chime in, or Lawrence, in terms of how we develop a particular CIP around some of these green infrastructure pieces.
Yeah, well, I think it's still, through you, Mr. Chair, I think it's still very much a work in process and something that we're going to have to look at in further detail. I don't think, to be honest with you, we're quite there yet in terms of how we do it, but exactly, as Mike said, exactly how you described it, that's how we look at, we're trying to incentivize that extra piece that we're going for here with some of these surgical items that we're speaking about. But in terms of, how we verify that, I think that was another part of your question afterwards. Do we ask for documentation of what the increased costs were and all that? Absolutely. That would be definitely part of the end product, because we need to ground truth that and make sure that everything that we are incentivizing, A, has been, installed as per what we expected, and B, what we're identifying those real and associated costs. So I think that is part of the equation for sure. But in terms of, how it's going to function from there, I think we're not quite there yet. We need a little bit more delving into it, to be honest with you.
If I could, Mr. Chairman, I think the only other comment I'd make, Councillor, is those are things we want to do as a matter of course anyways. Having a program is great, but, I'm going to suggest we're going to do everything, I think humanly possible to push the developer and the consortium to do these things anyways, because it does make for a better product. It does increase the ability for them to sell, and we only do have one chance to get it well. I think if we have in our toolkit something that we can then say, well, by the way, we have the following program that I think helps encourage it, great. But I suggest, I think every conversation that Director Bruder and I have been in, and others with the development and the development consortium, has very much been, you do need to create this type of destination in this location because we only have one chance to do it.
Thank you, Mr. Seo. And through you, Mr. Chair, one last question/comment. I am glad to see, again, that we are maturing through this process. And again, you can see how the conversations have changed over the last couple of years to where we are now. And I think that's very encouraging. The one thing I would ask, I think I talked to the CIO about this in the past, is our consultant that came in, I think it was in June, had mentioned that we should be reviewing our CIPs on a regular basis, if not yearly. And I know, again, through the process here, we haven't gone through this type of review. It sounds like ever since the first ones came through. And obviously, we're making up a lot of ground, and we're covering off 10 years of activity since 2011. So this process is going to be a lot longer the first time through. But is there a process that's been identified that we're going to be going through this on a yearly basis? Obviously a much condensed version, just going through what those yearly activities of the past have been to kind of determine the course of the next few years ahead. Has this been identified?
Kathleen, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So I guess there's a couple things here. Generally speaking, I mean, staff have been doing some research with other municipalities that have reviewed their CIPs. Generally speaking, they do it every 5 years. In between, it's much more a summary of the applications. Even though we've had the first CIP in place since 2011, it does usually, what we find with any CIP is it does take a few years before you start to get uptake. So when it comes to doing a much more detailed review like we're doing now, you also need to be able to review, much like some of the information you presented tonight. We also need a certain amount of data, a certain amount of completed projects in order to properly come up with some recommendations. So, doing it every year, probably the best you can do is provide a summary of the types of applications, but probably at least every 5 years, you should do a much more major review. And the other thing to keep in mind too, is even though we've had some CIPs in place for roughly 10 years, there has been some minor tweaks made to the programs throughout the years. So you can still do, minor tweaks to them as part of your annual look at some of your CIPs.
Thank you, Director Dale. Maybe it is just that rolling 3 or 4 year term that keeps on getting reviewed every year. So you're not looking at such a small portion of data. It's a much more, a little bit broader. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. And I will go to the mayor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a really excellent discussion tonight, and I think some very good points have come up. No question, we've been having the same discussions at the region, and it's interesting how a framework from the region perspective is one thing, but when it goes down to the municipal level and you start looking at what community needs look like, particularly around facade improvements when they're bundled with brownfields and some of the other important incentives, it's a whole different conversation. So as we're having those discussions, and we'll have that discussion undoubtedly again soon, we're moving also very slow because there had not been the kind of in-depth discussion that we're talking about here tonight. So, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make a couple of comments and then I have a question. This whole business of comparing to other communities is interesting in terms of what might be on the list in another community, but I don't pretend to think that we're going to be able to qualify or quantify why certain things are chosen. We'd have to watch a lot of council meetings to determine what the values are in any community to determine why they do what they do. But it is interesting, I believe, to notice that some communities have never entirely eliminated the process and eliminated the list. They've refined it, they've removed things, they've added things, but they have tried to look at the value add each time through. And there's no question about it. When you start looking at the kind of justification, that ground truthing that the CEO is talking about, now I think we're really at the core of how we want things to be in terms of that accountability. Secondly, commercial mixed use is very important. And I do believe it needs to be incentivized forever. I don't think so. Incentivized until we have the mix of services that the public want, and they want them. It's probably one of the biggest questions that I get. We need to continue to incentivize and try and get that that variety in the community. We don't want people shopping in other places. We want to keep the diversity of our community front and center. We're different than a bedroom community. And this was brought home to me when Minister Clark was here a couple of weeks ago. He was looking around in Jordan at the development that was happening there. He was keenly interested that there was commercial that was going to be attached to those live-work units. And he actually was explaining to me what had happened in another community where they had eliminated any industry, any advanced manufacturing from their economy and went strictly to a tourism model. So we've done something very deliberate here. And I certainly believe from the support of council, as we've been moving forward, that we're on the right track. So my question really is around the benefit of the economic diversity that's created by incentivizing current and future business within the CIP programs that we currently offer, because it'll get better as we go on. So I think there's a benefit to bundling. And I know somewhere in the document that it spoke about overlap. And so now we could very much and potentially have more items. We will take some off, we will put some on. How do we determine, and I want more, Mr. CAO, than the surgical approach. I want a little more detail here. So how are we going to evaluate whether programs should stand alone, whether you can put 2 or 3 items together without getting that overlap? Where do we think we're going with this? Because I think this is also important. Mr. Chairman, through you to the CAO and then whoever he wishes.
Mike, go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, to the mayor. I mean, let me try to tackle that economic diversity piece that I think the mayor highlighted at the beginning of her comments. And I think, you know, my comment to that would be, I think what we often hear from those business interests or development interests around commercial space is not wanting to build it. And they often say that to us because they say it's really not worth it from a financial perspective, meaning the demand maybe isn't there or the ratio of cost to the benefit is too high. And again, when I talked earlier about how we mature and start understanding what goes into these business models from a private sector, I think we start to understand some of those terms and what's involved there. So I think we need to look at that piece. Definitely commercial opportunities within all of our developments are something we want extensively. We want it in our intensification corridors. If I think of Ontario Street, if we think of, you know, some of the things we've been talking about in Vineland, those are the things we want. When we talk about incentives, it's what helps us get there. And I think, you know, to the comment around what's it look like as we move forward, I think once we establish that nucleus of successful economies, then more businesses come. There is a bit of a chicken and egg as it relates to businesses, and members of council hear this from residents, whether it be I don't want X type of business or I want more of Y type of business, and I won't highlight the types of businesses, I think we all know. I think that's our role when we start putting together these particular programs, Mayor Easton. As to your comment in terms of wanting more than just a surgical approach, I think I use that phraseology so council knows, you know, we're not just going to take a shotgun approach, and that is cast it out there and everything falls within the realm of a community improvement plan, but look at where we want it, look at the type of program, look at potential applicability of that particular program, and then develop those types of programs that we think people want and make sure that we're marketing them. I can't tell you right now what it looks like, because I think we want to go out there, we want to talk to people, we want to look at those who are really good in this area, how they're doing it and what they're doing it, and then talk to our own community. Make sure what we're proposing and putting forth fits the community's vision as a whole. And that vision that the community has, as reflected by council every 4 years, and in our strategic plans and our longer term planning documents, I think is important. And it is a holistic look. It's not just one segment of the community. It's not just young or old or youth. I think it's looking at all those particular segments. And so, I mean, that's the approach. We want to make sure that when we come forward, it's something that has been exhaustive, that really, though, focuses on those particular pieces. But economic diversity is the area that we're going to focus, I think, a lot of our efforts. And I define that really as commercial opportunities, residential opportunities, and the industrial opportunities that we have, both rural and urban.
Mr. Chairman, I just have a final comment. One of the things that I'm most appreciating about this, what we're doing here is, it certainly is a catch-up, if you will. It's certainly a rear view mirror exercise, no question about that. And we've moved considerably from a point of that there was just really a matter of putting money on the table and leaving it there for developers to take without any justification whatsoever. I don't know what would motivate a council to do that. I certainly never saw that we were doing that. I don't think that in 2011, the councilors that brought in the CIPs thought they were doing that. There's no question that the CIPs are much more complex in themselves than they were at that time. And so all of our efforts, I think, are really moving in the right direction. All the right questions are being asked. And I think that any council can take considerable satisfaction in knowing that they're doing their due diligence. And that's what this is really all about. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And as your chair, I really have nothing more to add. I think this was a great discussion. I think that you know, a lot of very thoughtful questions came out tonight, and it you know, just the fact that the CEO right out of the gate made the comment that it is time to look at our CIPs. I think that really is a strong statement that you know, we know that things have changed, and particularly over the last probably 2 or 3 years, that our market has certainly become a very attractive market in which to build. So appreciate everybody's input. And with that, I'm going to say that there being no further discussion, I have a motion moved by Councillor Brene. The council received for information report AD-21-21 regarding community improvement plan activity and monitoring. I will ask the deputy clerk to call out the vote. Yvonne, go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Brene?
Yes.
Councillor McPherson?
Yes.
Councillor Miklick?
Yes.
Councillor Pachariba?
Yes.
Councillor Reimer?
Yes.
Councillor Rajima?
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Russell?
Yes.
Councillor Timmers?
Yes.
And Mayor Easton?
Support.
Thank you. That carries, Chair.
Thank you. There are no additional reports for consideration this evening for the General Business and Finance Committee agenda. We move to confidential items. We will now consider item 6.1, motion to consider confidential items. Before I read the motion to move into closed, I would like to explain what will happen for those watching this electronic meeting. First, there will be a closed session statement that the deputy clerk will go through for all of council and staff that will be attending the closed session. Once that is completed, we will move on with the motion to move into closed. The deputy clerk will be turning off the live webcast during the closed portion of the meeting. Once we have completed the closed portion of the meeting, we will resume with the live webcast and carry on with the public portion of the meeting, and we'll read the motions in public session. I will ask Deputy Clerk Devan to conduct the closed session statement for all of council and others attending the closed session.
Thank you, Chair. Before we begin the closed session, all members are reminded that any discussion in closed are to remain confidential as per our procedural bylaw and our code of conduct for council of the town of Lincoln. I need each member that is attending electronically to confirm the following: that you understand that members are to remain confidential, and confirm no one else is present with you, and confirm no one else can hear this closed session, and confirm that you are not using any electronic devices other than your tablet, computer, telephone for video conferencing, and confirm that you are not recording this portion of the meeting. If you acknowledge all of the above statements, please reply with "I understand" and confirm to all of the statements as I read your name aloud. And Mayor Easton.
I'm sorry. Understanding and confirm to all of the statements.
Thank you. Councillor Rajima.
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
Deputy Mayor.
I understand and confirm to all the statements.
Counselor Bernay,
I understand and confirm to all the statements.
Counselor McPherson,
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
Counselor Micklick,
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
Counselor Timmers,
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
and Counselor Reimer.
Understand and confirm to all the statements.
Thank you. CEO Microcopolis,
I understand and confirm to all of the statements, although I do see Councillor Pachariva with his hand up.
oh, Counselor Pachariva, I missed you. I'm sorry.
Yes, you did. I understand and confirm to all of the statements, Deputy Clerk.
Thank you. Director of Legislative Services and Town Clerk Julie Kirklos.
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
Thank you. Director of Public Works Dave Graham.
I understand and confirm to all the statements.
Director of Planning and Development Matt Bruder.
I understand and confirm to all of the statements.
Thank you. And I, Deputy Clerk Devan Kripp, I understand and confirm to all of the statements. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I have a motion moved by Councillor Pachariva under Section 239 of the Municipal Act. Notice is hereby given that Council adjourn to closed session in order to address item 6.1 as follows. Item 6.1 pursuant to Section 239(2)B, personal matters about an identifiable individual as it pertains to an HR matter. I will now ask our Deputy Clerk to call up the vote.
Thank you, Chair. Counselor Bernay,
Yes.
Counselor McPherson,
Yes.
Counselor Micklick,
Yes.
Counselor Pachariva,
Yes.
Counselor Reimer,
Yes.
Counselor Regina,
Yes.
Deputy Mayor Russell,
Yes.
Counselor Timmers,
Yes.
and Mayor Easton.
Yes.
Thank you. That carries.
Deputy Clerk, please proceed with the technical requirements to move into closed session.
Give me one moment.